The crisp air of Rocky Mountain National Park greeted Harold and Toni Henthorn as they started their hike. It was their 12th wedding anniversary, a day meant for celebration, reflection, and shared memories. The trail wound through towering pines and jagged rocks, offering a view that stretched into the endless horizon. Toni adjusted her backpack, her laugh echoing faintly against the canyon walls. She had always loved the outdoors, though Harold seemed unusually insistent on choosing this particular trail. "Wait until you see the view from the top," Harold said, his voice carrying a tinge of excitement. Toni smiled, oblivious to the slight edge in his tone. The trail became narrower as they ascended, the rocks beneath their feet uneven and treacherous. Harold walked ahead, frequently glancing back with an encouraging grin. "Almost there," he said. Toni's breath quickened, not from exertion but from a creeping unease she couldn't quite place. As they rounded a bend, the cliff came into view. The expanse of wilderness stretched out below them like a living painting. Toni gasped, stepping closer to the edge. "It's beautiful," she murmured, her words carried away by the wind. Harold nodded, his gaze fixed not on the view, but on Toni. "Let me get a picture of you here," Harold suggested, pulling his phone from his pocket. Toni hesitated for a moment, but obliged, stepping carefully to the cliff's edge. The rocks beneath her shifted slightly, sending a shiver down her spine. The moment froze in eerie stillness. Harold's phone clicked. Then, chaos. Toni's scream pierced the air as the ground gave way beneath her. She clawed desperately at the rocks, her eyes wide with terror. Harold lunged forward but stopped short, his outstretched hand hovering inches away from hers. "Toni!" he yelled, his voice echoing through the canyon. And then, silence. Harold stood motionless for a moment, his expression unreadable. He pulled his phone out again, this time to dial 911. "My wife, she fell," he said, his voice calm, almost detached. The operator asked for their location, but Harold hesitated. "We're near Deer Mountain, I think," he added, his tone wavering slightly. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Harold paced along the edge of the cliff, occasionally glancing down into the abyss where Toni had fallen. He made no attempt to call out to her or climb down, just stood there, waiting. When the sound of sirens finally reached his ears, he took a deep breath and rehearsed his story one more time in his mind. By the time the rescuers arrived, Harold's demeanor had shifted. He was frantic, pointing wildly at the cliff's edge. "She slipped!" he exclaimed, his voice suddenly filled with urgency. "I tried to grab her, but she just fell." The rescue team worked swiftly, rappelling down the cliffside. As they descended, Harold lingered near the trail, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He avoided eye contact with the lead responder, who observed him with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Sir, can you describe exactly what happened?" the responder asked, his voice calm but firm. Harold hesitated. "We were taking pictures. She got too close to the edge. I told her to be careful, but she lost her footing." His words were measured, deliberate. The lead responder nodded, though his eyes lingered on Harold for a moment longer than necessary. "We'll do everything we can," he said before turning back to his team. As dusk began to settle over the park, the responders confirmed what Harold had already seemed to know. Toni was gone. Her body lay crumpled among the rocks below, her injuries consistent with a high fall. Harold's reaction was subdued. No outburst, no tears. He simply nodded and murmured, "I thought so." The responders exchanged uneasy glances. The night air grew colder, but Harold remained oddly composed. The lead responder finally approached him. "We'll need to get an official statement from you tomorrow," he said. Harold nodded again, his face a mask of calm. "Of course," he replied. "Anything to help." The following morning, the crisp silence of Rocky Mountain National Park was shattered by the hum of helicopters and murmurs of search and rescue personnel. News of Toni Henthorn's tragic fall had spread quickly, drawing attention not just for its gravity, but for the peculiar circumstances surrounding it. Harold stood by the trailhead, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face a blend of exhaustion and practiced grief. When the lead responder approached, Harold offered a slight nod, his voice steady yet strangely devoid of raw emotion. "I'm ready to give my statement," he said. "Let's take this slowly, sir," the responder replied, his tone calm but probing. "Start from the beginning. What happened yesterday?" Harold inhaled deeply, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "We were celebrating our anniversary. It was supposed to be a special day." He paused as if for effect. "I thought the trail would give us the perfect view. She wanted a picture, stepped too close to the edge and slipped. The responder's pen hovered above his notepad, his brows furrowing slightly. Did she say anything? Did you notice anything unusual before she fell? Harold hesitated. She didn't seem scared or anything. It happened so fast. I couldn't save her. His voice cracked at the last word, but the responder noted the absence of tears. Harold's delivery was precise, almost calculated, as though rehearsed. Meanwhile, back in Denver, Grace Rischel sat at her kitchen table, her hands trembling as she clutched the phone. The news of her daughter's death had struck her like a lightning bolt. Despite Harold's assurances that it was a tragic accident, Grace couldn't shake an unsettling feeling, a gnawing doubt that whispered something was amiss. She was always careful, Grace murmured to herself. Toni wouldn't just fall. Her mind raced back to conversations with her daughter, moments when Toni's voice wavered as she spoke of Harold. Sometimes he's so intense, Mom, Toni had said once. Grace had brushed it off at the time, chalking it up to the stress of their marriage. Now those words weighed heavily on her heart. By afternoon, Harold's account of the accident was submitted, but it raised more questions than answers. The responders team had discovered that the rocks near the cliff were undisturbed. No scuff marks, no signs of a struggle. The absence of such evidence didn't align with Harold's description of Toni slipping and grabbing for help. At the hospital morgue, the coroner's initial assessment confirmed that Toni's injuries were consistent with a high fall. However, there were peculiarities. Her hands showed no signs of defensive wounds, no scrapes that would indicate she had tried to grab onto the cliff's edge. This detail sparked hushed conversations among the responders. Could someone so cautious have made such a fatal mistake? Grace's unease deepened when Harold called her that evening. I'm so sorry, Grace, he began, his tone measured. Toni meant everything to me. What happened, Harold? Grace's voice cracked. How could this happen to her? I tried to save her, Harold replied quickly, almost too quickly. It was an accident. You know Toni, she loved taking risks. The words sent a chill down Grace's spine. Toni wasn't reckless. She had always been careful, measured in her actions. Grace clenched the phone tighter, her motherly instinct screaming that something was wrong. But Harold ended the conversation abruptly, claiming exhaustion. That night, Grace sat alone in Toni's old bedroom, surrounded by photographs of her daughter. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at one particular photo, a smiling Toni, her eyes bright with life. Grace whispered into the empty room, I will find out what really happened. Far from Grace's home, Harold sat in his Denver living room, flipping through paperwork. A folded document peeked out from a file marked Insurance. He tucked it away quickly when his phone buzzed, a reporter seeking a comment on the accident. Harold declined, muttering to himself, too soon. The cracks in Harold's story were already beginning to show, though he didn't seem to notice. For him, the worst of it was over. But for Grace, it was only the beginning. The air inside the church was thick with somber silence. Rows of mourners dressed in black filled the pews, their faces etched with sorrow. Toni Henthorn's funeral was a stark contrast to her vibrant life. Yet as family and friends gathered to say goodbye, there was an undercurrent of unease, an unspoken tension that no one dared voice aloud. At the front, Harold Henthorn stood next to Toni's casket, greeting guests with a solemn nod. He spoke softly, his words rehearsed, offering thanks for their support. She was my world, he said, his voice breaking slightly. But to Grace Rischel, watching from a distance, Harold's display seemed hollow, too measured, too controlled. Grace's hands clenched tightly around the program in her lap. The smiling photo of Toni on the cover was almost too much to bear. She deserved better, Grace thought, her grief twisting into a gnawing suspicion. She had tried to push the doubts aside, to focus on mourning her daughter. But Harold's behavior refused to align with the devastation she expected. The eulogy began, delivered by one of Toni's close friends. The words were heartfelt, recounting Toni's kindness, her dedication to her patients, and her love for life. But as the friend spoke, Harold's expression remained curiously distant. He fidgeted with his wedding band, his eyes scanning the room rather than focusing on the words being spoken. After the service, mourners gathered in small groups, whispering in hushed tones. Grace noticed how Harold avoided prolonged conversations, offering brief condolences before moving on. When one of Toni's colleagues approached him, asking about the circumstances of her fall, Harold's response was clipped. It was a tragic accident, he said firmly. She lost her footing. It could have happened to anyone. The colleague hesitated, then pressed further. Was there any sign That something wasn't right? I mean, Toni was always so careful. Harold's jaw tightened. There's nothing more to say, he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. He quickly excused himself, moving toward the refreshment table, where he busied himself with rearranging plates. Grace's heart pounded as she watched the exchange. She approached the colleague, her voice low. "What did he say?" The woman hesitated. "He's closed off, but something about the way he answered, it didn't feel right." Later, as the crowd thinned, Grace found herself standing by Toni's casket. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the polished wood. "I'll find out what really happened," she whispered. Her resolve was interrupted by Harold's voice behind her. "Grace, we should talk," he said, his tone neutral but insistent. Grace turned, her grief momentarily masked by suspicion. "About what, Harold?" "About moving forward," he replied. "Toni wouldn't want us dwelling on this. She'd want us to celebrate her life, not question it." Grace's eyes narrowed. "Celebrate her life? Or bury the questions with her?" Harold flinched, then quickly recovered. "I've answered everything. The authorities have no reason to believe anything other than what I've told them." But Grace wasn't convinced. "I'll need more than your word, Harold," she said coldly before walking away. The day dragged on, with Harold maintaining his composed facade, though cracks were beginning to show. Several guests noticed his apparent detachment, whispering amongst themselves about how unusual it seemed. "It's like he's already moved on," one murmured. As the funeral drew to a close, Grace returned home, her mind racing. She replayed the day's events in her head, scrutinizing Harold's every word, every movement. Toni's voice echoed in her memory, moments from their last phone call before the hike. "Sometimes I feel like I'm being watched," Toni had said, her tone half joking but tinged with something deeper. Grace sat at the kitchen table, her resolve hardening. "This isn't over," she thought, staring at a framed photo of her daughter. "Not until I know the truth." Meanwhile, Harold retreated to his home, his mask of composure slipping the moment he closed the door. He poured himself a drink, his hand trembling slightly. On the counter sat the file marked "Insurance," its edges frayed from frequent handling. Harold stared at it for a long moment before sliding it into a drawer, locking it away. But the questions Grace had raised, the whispers among the mourners, and the growing list of inconsistencies, these would not be so easily buried. Detective Ian Matthews sat at his desk, the fluorescent light above him flickering faintly. A folder labeled Henthorn Lynn lay open before him, its contents untouched for nearly 2 decades. Photographs of a crushed vehicle, witness statements, and the coroner's report stared back at him. Toni Henthorn's recent death had brought this case back into sharp focus. Lynn Henthorn had died in 1995 in what was deemed a freak accident. According to Harold's account, their Jeep had a flat tire on a remote road. While Lynn helped him check the spare, the vehicle inexplicably rolled forward, pinning her beneath it. She was declared dead at the scene. At the time, there had been no witnesses, and Harold's grief-stricken demeanor had cast a shadow over any lingering questions. But now, with Toni's death raising alarms, Lynn's case no longer seemed like an isolated tragedy. Matthews flipped through the coroner's report, his pen tapping against the edge of his desk. Lynn's injuries were severe, consistent with being crushed under the Jeep. However, one detail stood out. There was no sign of brake failure or mechanical malfunction. The car had been parked on a slight incline, and its parking brake was fully operational. Back then, it had been written off as a tragic mistake. Now it felt like a deliberate setup. Across town, Grace Rischel met with an investigator she'd hired to look into Harold's background. Grace had spent sleepless nights poring over every detail she could find about her former son-in-law. She had stumbled upon a chilling pattern. Harold had been the sole beneficiary of a substantial life insurance payout after Lynn's death, just as he stood to gain millions from Toni's policy. The investigator, a grizzled man named Paul, laid out a timeline of Harold's financial activities. In the months leading up to Lynn's death, Harold increased her life insurance policy by 50%, Paul said, pushing a document toward Grace. Sound familiar? Grace's stomach churned. It was the same pattern she'd discovered with Toni. Harold's charm, his calculated control over finances, and the eerie similarities between the two women's deaths formed a picture that was becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Matthews decided to visit the scene of Lynn's death. The desolate stretch of road was as quiet as it had been nearly 2 decades ago. He stood where the Jeep had supposedly been parked, picturing the events Harold had described. Something didn't add up. Why would Lynn be crouched behind the car when Harold was allegedly inspecting the tire at the front. And how could a vehicle with a secure parking brake suddenly roll forward? Back at the precinct, Matthews dug deeper. He uncovered a peculiar detail in Harold's initial statement from 1995. Harold had said he called for help immediately after Lynn's accident, but phone records showed a delay of nearly an hour between the time of the incident and the call to emergency services. What had Harold been doing during that time? The discovery sent a chill down Matthews's spine. He requested a copy of Harold's insurance claim from the time. Buried within the paperwork was another red flag. Harold had filed the claim less than 24 hours after Lynn's death. The urgency was unusual, to say the least. Grace, too, was unearthing unsettling details. As Paul combed through public records, he found that Harold had listed Lynn as the sole policyholder on another smaller insurance plan, a policy Harold had failed to mention to authorities. The payout from that policy, combined with the larger one, had allowed Harold to purchase a new home and start a consulting business shortly after Lynn's passing. It was a windfall disguised as tragedy. By now, Grace and Matthews had reached the same conclusion independently. Lynn's death was no accident. Harold's calculated moves painted a damning portrait of premeditation. The similarities between Lynn's and Toni's deaths were impossible to dismiss, but proving Harold's guilt after so much time had passed would be an uphill battle. Back in Denver, Harold sat in his living room flipping through old photographs. One of Lynn caught his attention, her bright smile beaming at the camera, unaware of the dark shadow looming over her life. Harold's lips curved into a faint, fleeting smile before he slid the photo back into the drawer, his face returning to its cold, detached mask. The cracks in Harold's facade were growing. With every detail uncovered, Grace and Matthews were closing in. Lynn's death, once dismissed as a freak accident, was now the key to unraveling a chilling pattern of manipulation and murder. Detective Ian Matthews leaned back in his chair, staring at the evidence spread across his desk. Photos of Toni's accident site, the forensic report from Lynn's case, and now something new, a folded map that had been retrieved from Harold Henthorn's vehicle. This map at first glance seemed innocuous, but when Matthews unfolded it, he froze. An X was marked on the trail where Toni had fallen. Matthews called his partner, Detective Sarah Clayton, into the room. "You see this?" he asked, pointing to the map. Sarah's brows furrowed as she studied the crude marking. "That's the exact spot where she went over," she muttered. "Why would he mark it?" "That's what I'm going to find out," Matthews replied. Meanwhile, Grace Rischel sat across town with her investigator, Paul. He'd been combing through Harold's emails and financial records, and his latest discovery only added fuel to Grace's growing suspicion. "He planned that hike months in advance," Paul said, pushing a printed email toward her. The subject line read, "Anniversary Surprise," an email Harold had sent to a friend. "Listen to this," Paul continued, reading aloud. "It's a perfect spot. Toni will love it." He looked up, his expression grim. This wasn't some last-minute idea. He chose that trail deliberately. Grace's hands trembled as she clutched the printout. Her mind flashed back to a conversation with Toni just weeks before the hike. "Harold's been so insistent about this trip," Toni had said. "I told him I'm swamped at work, but he won't take no for an answer." Back at the precinct, Matthews dug deeper into Harold's background. He found an unsettling pattern in Harold's history of planning outings. Before Lynn's accident in 1995, Harold had taken her on multiple drives through remote areas. Witnesses described Harold as meticulous, always scouting locations under the guise of being adventurous. Now, with the map as evidence, Matthews and Sarah decided to question Harold. They arrived at his Denver home, finding him seated in his living room with a whiskey glass in hand. His demeanor was relaxed, too relaxed. "Detectives," Harold said, standing to greet them. "What can I do for you?" "We have a few follow-up questions about the day of the hike," Matthews began, pulling the map from his folder. He unfolded it slowly, laying it on Harold's coffee table. "Care to explain this?" Harold's face tightened for a split second before he plastered on a smile. "That? Oh, it's nothing," he said casually. "I like to plan my hikes in detail. Was just a note to remind me of a scenic spot." "A scenic spot?" Sarah interjected. "It just so happens to be where your wife fell to her death." Harold's smile faltered. "Coincidence," he said flatly. "I didn't mean anything by it." The detectives exchanged a glance. Matthews leaned in, his voice firm. "Coincidence or not, Harold, we'll need you to come down to the station to clarify a few more details." That night, Matthews and Sarah stayed late at the precinct, piecing together a timeline. They uncovered more emails and calendar entries pointing to Harold's obsession with planning. He had visited the same trail multiple times in the months leading up to the hike, sometimes alone, sometimes with Toni. The repetition painted a chilling picture of premeditation. Meanwhile, Grace found herself unable to sleep. She stared at the email printout, her anger simmering. "You knew," she whispered to the photo of Toni on her nightstand. "You knew he wasn't who he pretended to be." In the following days, Matthews received a call from the forensic team. "Detective," the analyst began, her voice tinged with urgency. "We found something on the map. There's a faint impression. Looks like it was made with a ballpoint pen. It says, 'No turning back.'" Matthews felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just a plan, it was a declaration. The evidence was mounting, but Matthews knew they weren't at the finish line yet. Every piece of the puzzle had to fit perfectly to hold up in court. As he stared at the map on his desk, he made a silent vow. "I won't let him get away with this." At the same time, Harold sat alone in his dimly lit home, the locked drawer containing Toni's insurance documents just a few feet away. He poured another drink, his expression unreadable. To the world, Harold Henthorn was still a grieving husband, but the walls were closing in, and Harold knew it. Grace Rischel sat at her kitchen table, staring at the emails spread out in front of her. Each message felt like a piece of Toni's voice calling out from beyond. The fear, though subtle, was there in her words. Grace's hands trembled as she picked up one email, dated just a few weeks before Toni's death. "He's been so insistent about this anniversary trip," Toni had written to a close friend. "It feels strange. He's been acting overly sweet, but there's something behind his eyes. I can't put my finger on it." The words pierced Grace's heart. How had she not seen it? The signs were there. Toni had tried to tell someone, but no one had pieced it together until now. At the Denver precinct, Detective Ian Matthews and his partner Sarah Clayton were piecing together Toni's final months. Interviews with Toni's colleagues painted a clearer picture of her life with Harold, a life that seemed idyllic on the surface but was riddled with unspoken tensions. Her husband controlled everything, one colleague, Dr. Anna Fields, told Matthews. Her finances, her schedule, even the way she interacted with people. She would make light of it, saying, "Oh, that's just Harold." But you could tell it bothered her. Another coworker recalled Toni's behavior during her final weeks. She was distracted, fidgety, like she had something on her mind. I asked if everything was okay, and she said, "I just need to get through this trip. Then I'll figure things out." The coworker's voice broke. "I didn't push her. I should have pushed her." Back at Grace's house, Paul, the private investigator, arrived with another grim discovery. "I found something in Toni's digital archives," he said, setting his laptop on the table. He pulled up a draft email, unsent but saved to her account. Grace leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat as she read Toni's words. "I don't feel safe anymore," the email began. "Harold is hiding something from me. I've been trying to look at the bank accounts, but he changes the passwords. When I asked him about it, he just laughed and said I was imagining things. I don't think I'm imagining this." The draft ended abruptly, as if Toni had stopped mid-thought. Grace pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Toni had known something was wrong. She had tried to reach out, but the email had never been sent. Across town, Harold Henthorn was pacing his living room, the blinds drawn tight. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, but he ignored it. He knew the questions were mounting. Detectives had been calling more frequently, their questions sharper, their tone more accusatory. He could feel the net tightening around him, but his confidence remained intact. He had always been one step ahead, and he wasn't about to lose his advantage now. Detective Matthews, meanwhile, was focused on Harold's pattern of control. "This wasn't just about money," Matthews said to Sarah as they reviewed Toni's emails and bank records. "This was about power. He needed her to feel dependent, like she couldn't leave even if she wanted to." And when she started to pull away, Sarah added, he saw it as a threat. Grace, fueled by anger and heartbreak, decided to speak with Toni's closest friends. At a small cafe downtown, she met with Karen, one of Toni's oldest confidants. Karen shared a story that sent chills down Grace's spine. "About 6 months ago, Toni called me in the middle of the night," Karen said. "She was whispering like she didn't want Harold to hear. She said she found something on his computer, documents about life insurance policies she didn't know existed. She asked me, why would Harold need 3 different policies in my name?" Grace's fists clenched under the table. The pieces were falling into place, each revelation darker than the last. Toni had seen the signs. She had tried to investigate, but Harold had always been one step ahead, keeping her in a state of uncertainty until it was too late. As Grace drove home, her mind raced with memories of Toni's voice, her laughter, her quiet resilience. I should have done more, Grace whispered to herself. But it wasn't too late. If Harold thought he had silenced Toni forever, he was wrong. Back at the precinct, Matthews received a call from the forensic team. "Detective, we've recovered deleted files from Harold's laptop," the voice on the line said. "There are detailed notes about the hiking trails, including elevation data, risk assessments. It's like he was preparing for something. This wasn't just a hike." Matthews hung up, his jaw tightening. The truth was coming into focus, and it was darker than anyone had imagined. Detective Ian Matthews stared at the stack of documents on his desk, each page a thread in a tangled web of Harold Henthorn's financial dealings. His partner, Sarah Clayton, sat across from him, her eyes scanning the latest findings. "This guy didn't just live beyond his means," Sarah said, shaking her head. "He lived in a completely different universe." Matthews nodded. "And he funded it with his wives' lives." The deeper they dug, the more unsettling the picture became. Harold had a habit of draining joint accounts, moving money into private funds, and juggling debts that his wives never knew existed. Toni's financial records showed a pattern: small discrepancies at first, then larger withdrawals under vague labels like investment or maintenance. Sarah pushed a printout toward Matthews. "Look at this," she said. 2 months before Toni's death, Harold maxed out a credit line on their home. $50,000 gone in a single week. Toni's emails show she had no idea. Matthews frowned. "And then there's the life insurance." He flipped open another folder. Harold had taken out 3 separate policies on Toni, totaling nearly $4.7 million. The timing was damning. 2 of the policies were updated just months before the fateful hike. Toni's signature was present on one document, but it looked hurried, almost uncertain. "Forgery or coercion?" Matthews muttered under his breath. Grace Rischel, meanwhile, sat in her living room, her hands trembling as she reviewed the investigators' findings. Paul had uncovered yet another chilling detail. Harold had done the same thing with his first wife, Lynn. Life insurance payouts, hidden bank accounts, sudden purchases. Harold's pattern of financial manipulation spanned decades. "What kind of person does this?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The kind who sees people as opportunities, not as loved ones," Paul replied grimly. Grace's anger boiled over. "He planned it all," she said. "He didn't just steal their money. He stole their lives." At the precinct, Matthews and Sarah worked late into the night, tracing every financial trail Harold had left behind. Sarah paused, holding up a file. "You're going to want to see this," she said. It was an old business proposal Harold had submitted years ago, an investment pitch for a consulting firm he never opened. The date, just weeks after Lynn's death. "He didn't waste any time," Matthews said, his jaw tightening. "He killed her, cashed in, and moved on." But Harold's hubris didn't stop there. One line item caught Sarah's attention, a large transfer labeled Future Projects. It was a vague term, but it coincided with the period when Harold began courting Toni. "This wasn't just financial abuse," Sarah said. "It was predatory. He targeted women who trusted him, and he used that trust to destroy them." While Matthews and Sarah connected the dots, Harold was busy putting up his facade. He met with his lawyer, feigning ignorance about the growing suspicions surrounding him. "They're trying to turn my love for Toni into something evil," Harold said, his voice trembling just enough to seem genuine. "All I wanted was to take care of her." But even Harold's lawyer looked skeptical. "Harold, if there's anything you haven't told me, anything that could come back to bite us, you need to say it now." Harold's smile was thin, calculated. "There's nothing," he said. "I'm an open book." That evening, Grace received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "You're on the right track." The body of the email contained a single sentence: "Check the insurance payouts. He's done it before." Grace's heart raced as she forwarded the message to Paul and the detectives. The next morning, Matthews called Grace. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Harold filed a claim for Toni's life insurance less than 48 hours after her death. The ink on the death certificate wasn't even dry." Grace's voice shook with rage. "He didn't even pretend to grieve." "And here's the kicker," Matthews added. "The third policy, the one for $2 million, it had an additional rider, double indemnity for accidental death." Grace's stomach churned. "He made sure her death was profitable." The walls around Harold were closing in, but he remained calm, confident in his ability to outmaneuver anyone who tried to challenge him. What he didn't realize was that every dollar he had stolen, Every fraudulent signature and every hasty insurance claim was becoming the noose that would tighten around his neck. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the trial of Harold Henthorn began. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, some drawn by curiosity, others by their personal connection to Toni or Lynn. At the prosecution table, Detective Ian Matthews sat beside the legal team, his meticulous work now the backbone of their case. Across the room, Harold Henthorn sat with his defense attorney, his face calm, betraying none of the pressure surrounding him. The prosecution wasted no time. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the lead prosecutor began, her voice firm and deliberate. "This is not a case of unfortunate accidents. This is a case of manipulation, greed, and premeditated murder." She gestured toward Harold. "The man you see before you has meticulously crafted a facade, a mask of a loving husband, while orchestrating the deaths of not one, but two wives." The first days of the trial laid the foundation. The prosecution methodically presented the timeline of events, starting with Toni's death. They displayed the now infamous map with its ominous X, marking the exact spot of her fall. Forensic experts testified, explaining how the trajectory of Toni's fall contradicted Harold's story of her slipping. "The rocks near the edge showed no signs of disturbance," one expert said. "No scuff marks, no loose gravel, nothing consistent with an accidental slip." Harold's attorney tried to counter. "Isn't it possible she simply fell straight down without grabbing anything?" The expert's reply was swift. "Possible? Perhaps? Likely? Not at all." The courtroom tensed as the prosecution shifted to Harold's financial motives. Bank records, insurance documents, and witness testimonies painted a chilling picture. Toni's life insurance policies were displayed on a large screen, with the $4.7 million total highlighted in bold. The jury gasped audibly when they saw the double indemnity clause for accidental death. Next came the testimony of Toni's co-worker, Dr. Anna Fields. "Toni confided in me," Anna said, her voice steady but emotional. "She said Harold was secretive about their finances and that he'd increased her life insurance without her full understanding. She told me she felt uneasy, but she didn't want to cause trouble." The defense attempted to discredit Anna, suggesting her recollections were exaggerated. But the next witness shattered that effort, Grace Rischel. When Grace took the stand, the air in the courtroom seemed to shift. "Mrs. Rischel," the prosecutor began gently, "can you tell us about your relationship with your daughter and son-in-law?" Grace's voice wavered at first, but she quickly found her strength. "Toni was my only daughter," she said, her gaze fixed on the jury. "She was smart, kind, and cautious. Harold, he was charming, but over time, I saw the cracks. Toni started to confide in me. She felt controlled, isolated. She even told me she was afraid." Grace recounted finding Toni's unsent email, her voice breaking as she read its contents aloud. She wrote, "I don't feel safe anymore." The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, and even the most stoic jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The defense tried to poke holes in Grace's testimony, but their strategy faltered when the prosecution introduced evidence from Lynn's case. Photographs of the crushed Jeep and documentation of Harold's rapid insurance claim painted a damning parallel. Matthews watched Harold closely during this portion of the trial. For the first time, Harold's composure seemed to falter. His jaw tightened, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. The final blow of the day came when the prosecution called a surprise witness, Harold's former co-worker. The man's testimony added a new layer of darkness to the case. "Harold used to joke about life insurance," the co-worker said. "He'd say things like, 'It's the easiest payday if you play your cards right.' At the time, we thought he was kidding. Now, I'm not so sure." As the day's proceedings came to a close, the prosecution's case felt airtight. Grace sat in the gallery, her heart heavy but resolute. This was the justice Toni deserved. Harold, however, remained outwardly calm as he was escorted out of the courtroom. But for the first time, his mask slipped slightly, just enough for Matthews to catch the faintest glimmer of fear in his eyes. The courtroom was hushed as Harold Henthorn's defense attorney stood to address the jury. He adjusted his tie, casting a practiced look of sincerity toward the 12 men and women who would decide his client's fate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "what we have here is a series of unfortunate events being twisted into a narrative of malice. My client, Harold Henthorn, has been portrayed as a monster, a man who orchestrates tragedy for financial gain. But where is the solid proof?" He paused for effect, scanning the jury. The prosecution has presented coincidences and speculation, but speculation does not equal guilt. The defense focused on dismantling the prosecution's evidence piece by piece. First, they attacked the forensic findings regarding Toni's fall. A hired expert took the stand, presenting an alternate explanation. The trail where Toni fell is naturally unstable, the expert testified. Loose rocks and a steep incline make it entirely plausible that she slipped, as Mr. Henthorn described. The attorney seized this moment, turning to the jury. "There's no denying this was a tragedy," he said solemnly. "But tragedies happen, even to the best of us." Then came the financial motive. The defense argued that Harold's management of finances, though unconventional, wasn't illegal or unusual. "Life insurance is a common practice," the attorney said. "Many of us have policies to protect our families. Is it a crime to ensure your loved ones are cared for?" They presented Harold as a devoted husband who had been unfairly vilified. A handful of character witnesses, including distant acquaintances and former co-workers, were called to testify to Harold's generosity and dedication to his family. "He was always so thoughtful," one co-worker said. "I can't imagine him doing anything malicious." But the prosecution was ready. During cross-examination, they dismantled the defense's arguments with precision. When the forensic expert insisted that Toni's fall could have been accidental, the prosecutor fired back. "Is it typical for someone to plan a hike months in advance, marking an exact spot on a map for a spontaneous trip?" The expert hesitated. "Well, no, but—" the prosecutor pressed on. "And is it typical for someone to take out multiple life insurance policies on their spouse without their full knowledge?" The defense's momentum faltered further when the prosecution brought up Lynn's case. Though the defense tried to frame it as an unfortunate coincidence, the similarities between Lynn's and Toni's deaths were impossible to ignore. "Two wives," the prosecutor said, her voice cutting through the room. "Two tragic accidents, two massive insurance payouts. At what point does coincidence become premeditation?" As the trial continued, Harold's outward calm began to show cracks. During recess, Matthews observed him pacing in the hallway, his jaw clenched. The once confident mask he had worn throughout the trial was slipping. Sarah Clayton leaned in. "He knows the walls are closing in," she said softly. Grace Rischel, sitting quietly in the gallery, felt a flicker of hope. She watched the jury's faces as the evidence was laid bare, searching for any sign that they were beginning to see Harold for who he truly was. But the defense wasn't finished. They called Harold to the stand, a risky move, but one they hoped would humanize him. Harold took his place, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He spoke softly, recounting his version of events with calculated emotion. "I loved Toni," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Losing her, it shattered me. And now, to sit here and listen to these accusations, it's unbearable." For a moment, the room seemed to hang on his words, but the prosecution was relentless. When it was their turn to cross-examine, they went straight for Harold's inconsistencies. "Mr. Henthorn," the prosecutor began, "can you explain why you filed an insurance claim within 48 hours of Toni's death?" Harold's smile faltered. I thought it was the right thing to do, to secure our future." The prosecutor's voice rose, sharp and commanding. "Her future or yours?" The tension in the room was palpable as Harold struggled to maintain his composure. The jury watched him closely, their expressions unreadable. As the day ended, Grace left the courtroom feeling a glimmer of hope. Harold's confident veneer was cracking and the truth was finally coming to light. But the battle wasn't over yet. The courtroom was tense, every eye fixed on the prosecutor as she introduced the next piece of evidence. "Your Honor, we would like to submit new findings from the defendant's computer and digital archives." A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. Harold Henthorn shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tightening around the edges of the table. Detective Ian Matthews took the stand, his demeanor calm but focused. "During our investigation," he began, "we recovered files from Mr. Henthorn's personal computer that had been deleted but were retrievable. These files provide crucial insight into the planning of Toni Henthorn's death." The prosecutor handed a printed document to the jury. "This," she said, her voice steady, "is an email draft recovered from the defendant's computer. It was never sent, but the contents are damning." She began to read aloud. "Elevation and terrain are ideal, minimal foot traffic expected, high potential for misstep if positioned correctly." Gasps echoed across the room. Matthews explained the context. "This email was created 6 months before the hike. It includes notes detailing hazards on the trail where Toni fell. It's not a coincidence, it's a blueprint, the defense objected. Speculation, Harold's lawyer barked. There's no proof this email was connected to Tony's death. The prosecutor's lips curved into a faint smile. Then let's look at something more recent. She presented search history logs from Harold's laptop. These entries, she continued, occurred days before the hike. She listed them off, her voice growing sharper with each line. How to secure double indemnity on insurance. High fall injury patterns. Best trails for beginner hikers near Denver. The jury's unease was palpable. Harold's defense scrambled to object again, but the prosecutor pressed on. These searches are not innocent inquiries, she said firmly. They show intent. Harold's composure cracked further when the prosecution revealed recordings of phone calls he had made to an insurance agent. In one call, Harold inquired explicitly about payout timelines for accidental deaths. The agent, now testifying, recounted, "It struck me as odd how detailed his questions were, almost clinical." The prosecutor turned to Harold. "Mr. Henthorn, can you explain why you were so interested in life insurance payout procedures mere weeks before your wife's death?" Harold stood to object directly, his voice trembling with frustration. "This is all circumstantial," he shouted, his outburst silencing the room. The judge ordered him to sit, but the damage was done. For the first time, Harold's mask of control was fully shattered. Grace Rischel sat in the gallery, her heart pounding. She could see the cracks forming in Harold's defense, the jury leaning further toward doubt. Every detail unveiled was another nail in the coffin of his lies. But the prosecutor wasn't finished. She held up a document recovered from Harold's email drafts, a titled file named Plan B. Its contents were even more chilling. The file listed alternate methods to achieve results if the first plan failed, including phrases like vehicle failure, domestic accident, and outdoor hazards. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Grace's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the bench. This wasn't just premeditated, it was cold, calculated murder. When Harold returned to the stand, his defense attorney tried to spin the evidence as harmless preparation, insisting Harold's emails were misconstrued. "My client is a meticulous man," the attorney argued. "His attention to detail is not a crime." The prosecutor's retort was sharp. "Attention to detail is not a crime," she agreed, "but using it to orchestrate murder is." As the day came to a close, the weight of the evidence felt insurmountable. Harold's confident veneer had dissolved into visible anxiety. He avoided eye contact with the jury, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his tie. Matthews watched him closely, noting every sign of his unraveling. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed for updates. Grace stood apart from the chaos, her thoughts heavy. Tony's voice echoed in her mind, soft, uncertain, filled with unspoken fear. "I'll protect you," Grace whispered, her resolve hardening. "Even now, I'll protect you." Inside, Harold sat alone at the defense table, staring blankly at the pile of damning evidence. The world around him was closing in, the walls he'd built with lies now crumbling into dust. The courtroom was still, every breath held in anticipation as the jury foreperson rose. Harold Henthorn sat rigidly at the defense table, his face a mask of control, though his clenched fists betrayed the storm beneath. Grace Rischel gripped the edge of her seat in the gallery, her heart pounding as the foreperson began to speak. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Harold Henthorn, guilty of first-degree murder." A collective gasp filled the room, followed by murmurs that rippled through the spectators. Grace exhaled sharply, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time since Tony's death, a weight she had carried so long began to lift. Harold's reaction was chilling. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his lips pressing into a thin line. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, murmuring something inaudible, but Harold's eyes remained fixed ahead, unseeing. The judge addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your service. Your work here is done." As the jurors filed out, avoiding Harold's gaze, the tension in the room remained thick. Grace's focus stayed locked on the man who had taken her daughter from her, who had now been unmasked for the monster he was. The prosecutor stood, her voice steady and resolute. "Your Honor, we request immediate sentencing." The judge nodded, his expression stern. "Mr. Henthorn, you have been convicted of the premeditated murder of Toni Henthorn. This court finds your actions not only calculated and cold, but driven by greed and a complete lack of humanity. You exploited the trust of the people closest to you for financial gain, and for that, you will face the full measure of justice." The gavel struck, and the room erupted in sound. Reporters whispered into microphones, lawyers shuffled papers, and spectators leaned toward one another in hushed conversation. Through it all, Harold sat unmoving, his stoic demeanor unbroken. Grace, however, was overcome. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched a photo of Toni she had brought to court. Matthews approached her quietly, his voice low. "You did it," he said. "You fought for her." Grace shook her head. "We all did. She deserved this." Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Camera flashes illuminated the night as reporters called out questions to anyone leaving the building. Grace emerged, shielded by Paul and Matthews, but paused at the top of the courthouse steps. She turned toward the sea of cameras, holding Toni's photo high. "This is for my daughter," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion quivering beneath it. "For Toni and for every person who has ever been silenced by someone they trusted, let this be a warning. Justice will find you." Inside, Harold was led away in handcuffs. The weight of his conviction finally settled on him as the reporters' voices echoed faintly through the courthouse halls. He glanced back once, his eyes meeting Grace's through the glass doors, before he disappeared into the shadows of the justice system. Matthews lingered in the courtroom, his mind racing through the case's twists and turns. He thought of the evidence, the damning emails, the chilling testimony. Harold had been a master manipulator, a man who thought he could outsmart everyone. But he hadn't anticipated the strength of a mother's love, or the tenacity of the team determined to bring him down. That night, Grace sat alone in her home, the silence both deafening and comforting. She placed Toni's photo on the mantel, lighting a small candle beside it. "You're free now," she whispered, her voice breaking. "And so am I." As the candle's flame flickered, a sense of peace began to wash over her. Justice had been served, but Toni's memory would live on, a beacon for those who might one day face a similar darkness. The courtroom was empty now, the echoes of the gavel's final strike fading into memory. Outside, the crowd had dispersed, the media frenzy slowly dying as the world moved on to its next story. But for Grace Rischel, the end of Harold Henthorn's trial was not the end of her journey. Sitting in her living room, Grace stared at the photo of Toni on the mantel. The house felt quieter than usual, though the silence was no longer oppressive. For the first time in years, there was a sense of closure. Harold had been found guilty, sentenced to life without parole. Justice had been served, yet the ache of loss lingered, a constant reminder of what had been taken from her. Paul, the private investigator, visited her that afternoon. He carried a thick folder under his arm, filled with documents he'd uncovered during the case. "I thought you might want to see this," he said, placing it on the coffee table. "It's everything we found. Evidence, notes, correspondence. It's over now, but I figured you might want to keep it." Grace hesitated before opening the folder. As she flipped through the pages, the weight of everything she'd fought for settled over her. Each document told a story, not just of Harold's deceit, but of Toni's courage. "She knew," Grace whispered, her fingers brushing against the printout of Toni's unsent email. "She tried to fight back." Paul nodded. "She did, and because of you," her voice was heard. Meanwhile, Detective Ian Matthews sat in his office, reflecting on the case. The walls were covered in photos and diagrams from the investigation, the remnants of months of work. "We got him," Sarah Clayton said, leaning against the door frame. "But it doesn't feel like enough," Matthews nodded. "It never does. But it's something. Toni and Lynn deserved this. And who knows how many others he would have hurt if we hadn't stopped him." Sarah folded her arms. "What about those other names? The ones in his files? Do you think he could have been involved in more?" "It's possible," Matthews replied, his voice heavy. "But without concrete evidence, they'll remain unanswered questions." Grace spent the following weeks reconnecting with friends and family. The weight she carried for so long began to lift, though the scars remained. One day she visited a local women's shelter, sharing her story with a small group gathered in the quiet space. "If something feels wrong," she told them, her voice steady, "trust yourself, speak up. You have a right to be heard." Her words resonated deeply. The women listened intently, some nodding, others wiping tears. Grace realized that by sharing Toni's story, she could help others avoid the same fate. Harold, meanwhile, adjusted to life in prison. His confident facade had crumbled entirely, replaced by a hollow resignation. The walls of his cell were bare, save for a single photo of Toni he had managed to keep. He stared at it often, though not with affection. To Harold, it was a reminder, not of love, but of the empire he had built and lost. Back in Denver, Grace stood at Toni's gravesite. The sky was overcast, the wind carrying the scent of rain. She placed a bouquet of white lilies on the ground, kneeling beside the headstone. "We did it, Toni," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're safe now." The clouds parted slightly, a ray of sunlight breaking through to illuminate the grave. Grace took it as a sign, not of forgiveness, but of peace. She rose, her heart heavy yet lighter than it had been in years. As she walked away, she thought of the countless women like Toni, trapped in silent battles. She vowed to dedicate her life to helping them, ensuring that Toni's memory would not fade into obscurity. Her daughter's story was no longer just a tragedy. It was a warning, a call to action, and most importantly, a legacy of resilience. The cold gray walls of Harold Henthorn's cell were his world now, a stark contrast to the sprawling landscapes he once used as the backdrop for his sinister plans. The man who once exuded confidence and control now sat alone, his empire of lies dismantled, his mask permanently removed. He avoided the other inmates, retreating further into his own mind, a place filled with calculations, regrets, and the haunting faces of Lynn and Toni. But Harold's imprisonment wasn't the end of the story. Outside those prison walls, questions lingered. Detective Ian Matthews couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. Harold's arrogance, his precise planning, and the breadth of his manipulations suggested that Toni and Lynn might not have been his only victims. Matthews spent late nights combing through cold case files, searching for patterns that matched Harold's methods. In one file, he found a familiar thread: a woman who had died in a freak accident during a camping trip with her fiancé, a fiancé who disappeared shortly after her death. Another case involved a car crash eerily similar to Lynn's. Both incidents had been ruled accidents, but Matthews saw Harold's shadow lurking in the details. Meanwhile, Grace Rischel's life had taken a new direction. Toni's death had left a void that could never be filled, but Grace channeled her grief into advocacy. She began speaking at domestic violence shelters and community centers, sharing Toni's story as a cautionary tale. "Trust your instincts," she would tell the women she met. "Don't ignore the red flags, and if you feel trapped, know that there's help." Her efforts gained traction, and soon she was working with national organizations to raise awareness about financial abuse, a silent weapon Harold had wielded with devastating precision. Through her work, Toni's name became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was light to be found. Yet, even as Grace moved forward, she couldn't escape the occasional pangs of what-ifs. On quiet nights, she would sit by the window, her thoughts drifting to Toni's laughter, her kindness, her dreams left unrealized. "I'm doing this for you," Grace would whisper to the darkness. "I won't let him erase you." Harold's legacy, however, was one of destruction. His crimes had left a trail of pain that rippled far beyond his immediate victims. Families were torn apart, trust shattered, lives forever altered by his selfish greed. And though he now lived in obscurity, his name continued to evoke anger and disbelief, a cautionary tale of how darkness can hide behind the most charming smiles. Detective Matthews wasn't the only one haunted by Harold's past. Paul, the investigator who had helped Grace, kept receiving anonymous tips even after the trial. One email hinted at another woman Harold had dated before Toni, a woman who vanished without a trace. Paul forwarded the information to Matthews, whose determination to uncover the full extent of Harold's crimes only deepened. As the years passed, Harold's name faded from the headlines, but his story remained a chilling reminder of the lengths some will go for power and money. For Grace, the wounds Harold inflicted would never fully heal, but she found solace in knowing that his darkness had been exposed for all to see. One evening, Grace stood by Toni's gravesite, a small bouquet of daisies in hand. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the headstone. "You're remembered, Toni," she said softly, her voice steady. "You're loved, and you're safe now." A gentle breeze stirred the flowers, carrying Grace's words into the quiet dusk. As she turned to leave, her heart felt lighter, though the fight against people like Harold was far from over. Grace knew there would always be more work to do, more lives to protect, and more stories to tell. And in a cold prison cell, Harold sat alone, staring at the blank walls. He could no longer manipulate, no longer control, no longer hide. The darkness he had sown was now his only companion, a fitting legacy for a man who thrived in shadows. What do you think of Harold Henthorn and the chilling details of his actions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the most shocking true crime cases. See you in the next video.